Welcome back, Highlanders. This is Lecture 2 for Chapter 1. We're going to pick it up with where we left off last time, but a quick review. We're marching through those 8 guideposts to economic thinking. The last one we talked about at the end of the last lecture was number 4, individuals making decisions at the margin. And we finished with a cost-benefit analysis. That's where you compare the marginal benefits and the marginal costs. And remember, you only want to undergo an action if the marginal benefits outweigh the marginal costs. You do not want to undergo an action if the marginal costs outweigh the marginal benefits. So the last example we looked at was the costs and benefits of social distancing during the coronavirus outbreak. Remember, according to the best estimates of healthcare professionals and economists, that if we don't engage in social distancing, then there could be as many as 2.2 million deaths as a result of the coronavirus, but our GDP for that year would be about $22 trillion, or at least that's the estimate. As a result of social distancing, we're only going to have about 1.6 million deaths as a result of the coronavirus, but it's going to cost us about 30% of our GDP, which again is just a measure of production for the economy, and so that's about 15.4 trillion. So the marginal benefit of social distancing is that it'll save 600,000 lives, but the marginal cost was that it'll cost us about $6.6 trillion in lost production. So comparing 600,000 lives to $6.6 trillion, it comes out to about $11 million per life. Now, the exam, I might not ask you whether or not you should engage in social distancing because that's more of a subjective question, but I might give you these numbers and then ask you how much is it going to cost us per life, or how much is it going to cost us in lost GDP to save each life if we do engage in social distancing. So be able to do that math and figure out that particular question. So that's the last thing we talked about at the end of that last lecture. So let's go and pick it up with the new stuff. Starting off with guidepost number 5, information helps us make better choices, but is costly. So we often make decisions without perfect information. So the bigger the decision, the more information we're going to gather, but no matter how big the decision is, we're never going to have perfect information when making a decision. And of course, the smaller the decision is, then the less information we're going to gather when making that decision. So for example, when it comes down to buying a house, right, then you're going to make you're going to gather a lot more information when you're making that decision about what kind of house to buy, right? You're going to do things like hire a real estate agent who's going to gather a lot of information for you. You're going to go to a lot of different open houses and look at homes. You're going to look at a lot of different houses on the internet, right? There's a lot of information you're going to gather. Now, you're not going to go to every single open house available. You're not going to look at every potential house that could be bought or interview or investigate every single real estate agent. But you can gather a lot of information until you're comfortable you're going to make a pretty good decision, because that's a pretty big decision in your life. But when it comes to something like buying a new notebook, you're not going to gather nearly as much information because it's not that big of a deal if you make a wrong choice. So for example, you're certainly not going to hire a representative to go investigate notebooks for you. You're probably not going to take a look at a lot of different notebooks online. You're certainly not going to go out to the stores and examine a bunch of different notebooks before you decide which one to buy. You're probably just going to go to the store, look at a couple in the notebook aisle, and choose the one that best meets your needs. Right. So again, the bigger the decision, the more information you're going to gather. Right. But no matter how big the decision is, you're not going to have perfect information. But the less you estimate that decision is going to impact your life, or the smaller the decision, then the less information you're going to gather. And with that in mind, that brings us to this idea called the rational ignorance effect, which basically explains why so many people choose to become ignorant of our current politics. So just to give you an idea, anywhere between 1916 and 2018, our typical voter turnout is only about 50 to 60% of the voting age population. So only about 50 to 60% of the voting age population actually comes out to vote every election. And again, that's not a millennial or Generation Z thing. That's pretty much been true anywhere between 1916 and present day. Right. So why is that? Why do so few people choose to turn out and vote? Right. So are you going to vote in the 2020 election? Right. Some people might say yes. Some people might say no. But according to the economists, here are kind of the marginal costs and marginal benefits of voting. So we're going to go back to that guidepost number 4 and see if we can go through a cost-benefit analysis when it actually comes to voting. So the marginal benefit of voting is the probability that you are the deciding voter which is basically the probability that your candidate's going to win by a single vote, and it was your one vote that put them over the top. And the reason why that's important is because if your candidate wins by, say, 100 or 200 or 500 votes, then you don't really get any benefit out of voting because you didn't really change or influence the election at all. So if your candidate wins or loses by hundreds or thousands of votes, then you might as well stay home on election day, and it wouldn't really have changed anything. So again, it's the probability that you are the deciding voter multiplied by how much you care that your preferred candidate wins. So obviously, if you don't really care which candidate wins, then that's going to reduce the marginal benefit of voting. But even if you do really care how much your preferred candidate wins, so you have a strong preference for one candidate over the other, right? The probability that you're going to be the deciding voter in an election, particularly a national election like for president, is incredibly low, right? It's really small. In fact, it's pretty close to zero. So it's not quite zero, but it is really close to zero, right? In fact, you have a greater chance of dying in a fiery car crash on the way to the voting booth than being the deciding voter or the one person that influences the election because your candidate won by a single vote and it was your vote that put him over the top. So again, no matter how much you care that your preferred candidate wins, right, anything multiplied by zero is zero. Anything multiplied by a really small number that's close to zero is also going to be really small or really close to zero. So the marginal benefit of voting is pretty close to zero. With that in mind, the marginal cost of voting is the time, effort, and any resources needed to inform yourself, register to vote, and actually vote. Right, so the time it takes to investigate the issues or the candidates and decide which one you prefer, to register to vote if you aren't registered already, and to actually go to the voting booth, stand in line, wait to vote, and actually cast your informed vote, right? All of that is the marginal cost of voting. So even if you don't gather that much information, and even if you're already registered, it's still going to take at least a little bit of time, maybe 15 to 20 minutes, in order to go down to the voting booth and actually cast an informed vote, right? So your marginal cost of voting at the very least is at least maybe 15 minutes worth of your time, right? So when it comes to comparing the marginal benefits of voting, which is pretty close to zero, and then the marginal cost of voting, which is at least 15 minutes of your time, for a lot of people, the marginal cost of voting would outweigh the marginal benefits of voting, which is why so many people choose not to vote on election day. Again, only about 50 to 60% of the voting age population actually turns out to vote in each election, right? So now, again, when it comes to deciding whether or not to vote, you perceive that you're not going to be able to change the election all that much, and that's why you might choose to stay home, or at least not become that informed when you do cast a vote, since your vote's not going to really matter all that much, right? So with that in mind, that explains why so many people choose not to vote. Again, this decision is pretty small in terms of how it's going to affect your life. So with small decisions, you don't gather that much information. Right. So why is it that so many people do choose to vote? In other words, how do we explain the 50 or 60% of the population who chooses to get up out of bed, drive down to the voting booth on election day, and cast a vote? Is it that people just want to avoid the worst possible potential outcome? Well, that's going to be unlikely answer because, again, you're more likely to die in a fiery car crash on the way to the voting booth than actually being that deciding voter. So if you're trying to avoid the worst possible potential outcome of, say, maybe your candidate losing because you didn't vote, then chances are you might just choose to stay home because that car crash is more likely and something you're probably going to want to avoid more. So what might be some other reasons why people choose to go out and vote on election day? Well, some other benefits of voting include the fact that some people just like voting. They enjoy being a part of the civic process, right? They think of it as doing their civic duty. They actually enjoy being a part of the process, and therefore they might choose to go out there and vote just because they like voting, right? Also, a lot of people like to go out there and vote because then they get that I voted sticker, which they get to wear proudly, and again, maybe tell people on Facebook about how they voted, engage in that kind of virtue signaling behavior. They've actually done studies, and when the polling booths run out of those stickers, people actually stop going to that particular voting booth, right? And also involved in that includes avoiding social pressure, right? Some people might choose to vote just to avoid pressure from people who say yell at them if they don't vote because they aren't doing their civic duty. I know a lot of times when I choose not to vote, my father will yell at me and give me a 45-minute lecture about how I should vote and how people have died for my right to vote. And in order to avoid that lecture, it might be actually easier to just go out there and vote. Right. So this helps explain why we are often so ignorant of our own political process and our own political representatives. Right. Again, we don't perceive that it really affects our life that much or that we can do that much about it, so we don't gather that much information. Right. So a lot of people in class will know, say, more cast members on Game of Thrones than they know their own representatives or own political representatives in, say, the state of California. Right. I often ask my class to raise your hand if you can name at least one member of the Senate or House of Representatives from the state in which they are from or the state in which they are currently living, and very few people can do it. But almost everybody knows at least two or three cast members on the Game of Thrones or two or three finalists on American Idol. Right. So we're often pretty ignorant about our own political process. We don't really gather that much information about our own politics to cast an informed vote, because again, we don't perceive that it affects our lives all that much. So that's known as the rational ignorance effect, and be interested to see what happens in this 2020 election. But my guess is you'll probably be in that same 50 to 60% range of registered voters actually turning out to vote. So again, the bigger the decision, the more information you'll gather. The smaller the decision, or the less you perceive it affects your life, the less information you'll gather. And that's why more people will know more sports or Hollywood trivia than they will know who, say, the mayor of the city in which they're currently living or their own political representatives. So let's go ahead and move on to our sixth guidepost, economic thinking. This is one that we kind of highlighted or mentioned when we talked about number 3 on people responding to changes in incentives. And number 6 is beware of secondary effects. So economic actions generate both direct and indirect effects. You got to be careful of what those secondary or indirect effects might be. So a secondary effect is the indirect impact of an event or policy that may not be easily and immediately observable. Right, so again, it's the indirect impact of event or policy that may not be easily and immediately observable. So if you look at the picture there and you read the caption, it says the New York subway system bans canines unless they can fit in a small bag. So this guy trained his pit bull to calmly sit in his small bag. Now, the intention of the policy of banning canines unless they fit in a small bag is probably to try to keep large dogs off the subway, but creating a policy like that creates a secondary effect or unintended consequence of encouraging people to have their big dogs learn how to sit in bags so that they can carry them on the subway with them. Right. So again, this created a secondary effect or an unintended consequence that the policymakers probably didn't originally think about when they enacted this policy, but it didn't stop people from again responding to the incentives they faced and creating a situation that was unexpected. So let's go through a couple of macroeconomic examples of again how policy has affected our lives and maybe unintended ways. So fuel efficiency regulations have been passed that has caused new cars being produced to have to meet certain fuel efficiency standards. So they have to be able to get so many miles per gallon. And in order to reach those fuel efficiency standards, a lot of times these cars now are being made smaller and lighter. Well, that's created some unintended consequences. One of which is that smaller and lighter cars are less likely to be able to protect you in an accident. So it's actually increased the total number of traffic-related fatalities as a result of accidents because, again, these cars are being made smaller and lighter, which are going to be less able to protect you in the event that you are in an accident. So you have more people dying as a result of these smaller and lighter cars. Now, that wasn't the intention of the policy. The intention of the policy was to make cars more fuel efficient, but unfortunately, the outcome of this policy was to actually increase the total number of traffic-related fatalities. So that was a secondary effect that wasn't immediately thought of when this policy was passed. Also, unfortunately, when you make cars smaller, lighter, and more fuel efficient, you make them cheaper to drive, and so that will cause people to drive cars more, which unfortunately reduces the environmental benefit that's supposed to come as a result of this policy. Again, people maybe didn't think about people driving their cars more because they're cheaper to drive when they enacted this policy. And so it's something that should have probably been thought about more before this policy was passed. Trade restrictions is something that presidents from all political parties tend to pass during their time as president. For example, when President George W. Bush was in office, He imposed a trade restriction on steel from other countries in order to help American steel producers. When President Obama was in office, he practiced or imposed a trade restriction against Chinese tires in order to help U.S. Tire manufacturers. And now that President Trump's in office, he has also imposed trade restrictions against foreign steel in order to help those American steel producers. Right. So what are some of the secondary effects of these trade restrictions? Let's go ahead and take a look at a quick picture to help illustrate this. So we're going to talk about two countries. I'm going to go ahead and try to draw them here. I'm going to do my best to draw these countries, but a quick note about my artistic ability is I was a great artist back in kindergarten, but then I kind of retired from art, so I haven't really progressed since then. So I'm still kind of the same caliber of artist that I was back in kindergarten. So that is a picture of the United States, believe it or not. At least that's my best artistic rendering of it, right? So you got like Hawaii out here somewhere. You got like Alaska up here somewhere, right? But that's the United States. All right. And if you go all the way across the world over here, you're going to have China. Here's my best artist rendering of China, right? So again, so there's no confusion, that's the US. And that is China, right? So again, the way it worked before these trade restrictions were in place is the United States might import a lot of steel over from China because it's cheaper to buy steel from China than it is to produce steel here in the United States. And then the countries like China might import things like microchips from the United States because it is cheaper for them to buy microchips from the United States than it is to produce microchips on their own. Right. Now, when President Trump gets in charge and he says, hey, here's what we're going to do. We're going to stop buying steel from China, or we're going to put huge taxes on that steel from China, so people will buy more steel made by Americans here in America for Americans, and that's going to help our domestic steel producers. Essentially what he's going to do is he's going to stop the boatload of steel coming over, saying, hey, if you want to buy steel from China, you're going to have to pay extra high taxes on it. And the idea is that that's going to help our American steel producers over here in, say, Indiana or someplace, right? They're going to be more likely to be producing steel because people are going to buy steel from them. That's going to help give these steel workers jobs, help raise their wages, and help those steel companies, right? So if you are a steel company, or if you are a steel worker, or if you're a member of the steel workers union, then you're going to be very supportive of this policy. And President Trump's going to pass this policy in an effort to help that steel industry. Now, the unintended consequence or secondary effect of this particular policy, something that President Trump might not have initially thought about, is that if we put a trade restriction against steel coming over from China, people in China aren't going to like that. They're going to put a trade restriction against things that they import from the United States, including those microchips. In other words, if you stop the boatload of steel coming over, you're going to stop that boatload of microchips going back. And that's really going to hurt people who are producing microchips out here in California or up here in Washington, right, where a lot of microchips get produced, right? You're not going to help those industries out at all, right? So again, you are not helping the domestic steel producers at the expense of the Chinese steel producers. You are helping the U.S. steel producers at the expense of the U.S. microchip producers. In other words, whenever you try to help out U.S. businesses by putting in these trade restrictions against foreign companies, you're going to end up hurting U.S. exporters because those countries are going to put in those retaliatory tariffs or trade restrictions against those U.S. companies. Right. So again, there's a secondary effects to think about. Also, something else worth thinking about is all the consumers in both countries, whether it be the United States over here or all the consumers in China over here, right? They're all made worse off by these policies because now in the United States, you either have to pay this extra high tariff on Chinese steel, or you're going to have to buy that more expensive U.S. steel, right? If you're over in China, you now have to pay an extra high tariff on U.S. microchips, or you're going to have to produce microchips in China, which could be more expensive, right? So you're going to make consumers in both countries worse off, and again, you're only going to help a company in one country at the expense of, say, a different company or different industry in that same country. So when President Trump is going to pass his steel tariff, again, he's thinking about all the steel workers he's going to help. He's not necessarily thinking about or even knowing about the microchip workers or microchip industry that he is going to hurt. Right. So again, whether you are Democrat or Republican, again, presidents from both sides have passed these policies because these policies tend to be politically popular in the sense that a lot of steel workers and say steel unions are going to be supportive of this, right? But again, it's going to hurt other industries who may not even know how they're going to be affected until these retaliatory tariffs are in place, right? So keep that in mind, right, as you examine the effects of these kinds of policies. These are one of the reasons why economists tend to prefer free trade over trade restrictions. All right, so let's continue on and talk about the seventh guidepost economic thinking, and that is that the value of a good or service is subjective, which just means that the value of a good or service is worth different amounts to different people. Okay. So because the value of a good or service is subjective, we can engage in what we call voluntary exchange, and both sides be made better off as a result. So I'll give you an example. So I had a friend from Australia, and people in Australia are very crazy about this spread called Vegemite. I've tried it myself and don't particularly care for it, but again, people in Australia really love it. What he did not like, however, was Nutella. He thought that was disgusting, and he doesn't understand why Americans love it or why they eat so much of it. So chances are, if you were raised in the United States, you might like Nutella, but you might not like Vegemite. But if you were raised in Australia, you might prefer Vegemite over Nutella. So imagine that you are a U.S. citizen who prefers Nutella, but you don't have any, but you are in possession of Vegemite. You come across somebody from Australia who prefers Vegemite, but they don't have any. However, they do have some Nutella. Well, these two individuals can engage in a voluntary exchange, and both sides be made better off as a result, right? Because the U.S. citizen prefers the Nutella over the Vegemite, and because the Australian citizen prefers the Vegemite over the Nutella, right? Both sides can make this exchange, and both sides be made better off as a result. So again, the value of a good or service is subjective, and that means that you can engage in this voluntary exchange, and both sides win. This is a pretty important thing to understand because a lot of times when you go over things like the labor theory of value and what really was a big proposition made by Karl Marx into why he thought that socialism was a more effective method of production, he went into this idea that the value of a good or service depends on how much labor was spent creating that good or service or the cost of the resources that were used to make that good or service, and that's what gave something its value. And because of that, the only way that you can sell a good or service for more than what the labor or resources that went into producing it were worth was if you either underpaid the labor or you charged consumers too much for that good or service, right? So the only way that you could profit off of selling goods and services was by exploiting other people. And the reason why that has turned out to not necessarily be the case is because, as it turns out, the value of a good or service doesn't necessarily depend only on the labor or the raw materials that go into producing it, but depends on how much you prefer it over other things. Or again, the value of that good or service is subjective rather than objective. It depends on whose hands that good or service is in, rather than, again, something as objective as labor hours or the cost of the raw materials. Right. So through voluntary exchange, again, we can create value, and moving goods and services to those who value them most is a primary source of economic progress, or again, a way that we go from getting less out of our resources to getting more out of those resources. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and move on into the eighth and final guidepost economic thinking, and that is the test of a theory is its ability to predict. So we say that if real world events are consistent with a theory, then that theory is valid. So how do we test the accuracy of a theory in economics? Well, we use data from the real world, and we see if that data actually predicts or demonstrates what that theory says it will. If it does, then we say that theory is valid. If it doesn't, then we need to either re-examine that theory or retest it and make sure that we are conducting this test accurately. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go through a quick example of how this works with a video clip. So this video clip is from a show called Myths, Lies, and Downright Stupidity. It was a show hosted by John Stossel back when he was with ABC as a news correspondent. And it's basically like the first version of Mythbusters before Mythbusters ever existed. right? So we're going to take a look at this myth of whether or not elephants are afraid of mice. And rather than believe that myth just because we've always heard it, John Stossel is actually going to test that myth and see if it's true. So let's go ahead and watch this clip, and then we will discuss it afterwards.
We're down to our final 3 myths. So, number 3, elephants are afraid of mice. I've heard that one since I was a little kid. So, to check it out, we went to look for some elephants.
Welcome to the greatest show on earth!
We found them at the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus. Ed Clown let me ask the audience, what are elephants afraid of?
Mice.
Mice?
Yes, they always scared of mice.
Elephants are afraid of mice.
What are elephants scared of?
Mice.
Oh, I'll do something about this. Many of them learned about elephants fearing mice from cartoons like Dumbo. And lots of other cartoons. But why would a big animal fear such a small one?
Think about it, adults, we're afraid of little bugs, and we're like 30 times their size. So I can understand that elephants are a little afraid of mice.
And what would one of these elephants do if we showed them a mouse?
They would run me over and get scared. An elephant would just run right through the wall.
Would they really? I decided to find out. Any interest? Not much. Troy Metzler, the circus elephant trainer, let me take one white mouse and show it to this elephant. She looks bored with my mouse. Troy says he's seen mice around elephants. They like the hay, but he's never tested the myth up close.
We've never really gave it a thought. I'm glad we got the chance.
Seemed to me the elephant was more likely to inhale the mouse than fear it. Okay, we'll suck that in, okay? Troy showed mice to several of his elephants. Can she even see that it's a mouse?
She can. I mean, it's not, they don't have the greatest eyesight, but if you throw an M&M down, they definitely see it. And she definitely feels it because they have very sensitive skin. They feel mosquitoes like you and I. So she knows the mouse is there, and she really doesn't care too much.
He's trained elephants for 24 years and says elephants fear no animal.
They're the kings of the jungle because they have no natural enemies. Are you afraid of mice? Are you afraid of mice?
All right, so in looking at that clip, we can see that when we actually test this theory up close, it does not appear that elephants are afraid of mice. So an economist might conclude that that theory isn't valid. Right, but with that in mind, there's something that you need to look out for, right? Keep in mind that we were looking at trained circus elephants here, and they might be more tolerant of mice in the same way that they've been trained to be more tolerant of any kind of animal that's around them, or loud noises, or anything that goes on during that circus performance. So it might not be a fair test to look at, say, trained circus elephants and how they react to mice. You might want to be to conduct a more accurate test, look at, say, elephants out in the wild and how they react to mice. And so that's an important part of testing theories is you need to control these other potential confounding variables in order to make sure that you have the most accurate test, which is something that we are going to be talking about in our next lecture or part 3 of our chapter 1 lectures here. Right, but for now, just know that the day-to-day work of most of your economic professors or most economists around the world are testing theories and trying to control for these potentially confounding variables. So when they're not making economic videos for you to watch, or when they're not holding office hours, chances are your economic professors are out there testing various theories to, again, see if they hold up under the data that we observe in the real world. And that's it for part 2 of our chapter 1 lectures. So we're going to go ahead and leave it off here right now. And then when you come back for part 3, we're going to continue on and talk a little bit about positive versus normative economics. So this is where we're going to pick it up at the beginning of our next lecture. Until then, I hope you all are having a good day. Stay safe and stay healthy, and I'll see you next time.